Very good. We'll begin with a prayer in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, and fill the hearts of your faithful. Kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created.
And thou shalt renew the face of the earth.
Let us pray, O Lord, who enlightens the hearts of your faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that in the same Spirit we may be truly wise, and ever enjoy his consolation. Through the same Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Our Lady, Queen of Heaven,
Pray for us.
St. Thomas More,
Pray for us.
in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for coming to the new series of talks on the theology of the body. And before we launch into them, just a little bit of background on these series of talks. First of all, they are when the Pope Paul VI was doing this, I'm not sure if John the 23rd, St. John the 23rd was doing this, but anyway, whenever a Pope is in Rome, not during the summer months, and not during summer months, and he's in Rome on a Wednesday, he has these things called the Wednesday audiences. And basically, it's a way of meeting as many people as possible, and within a confined period of time. Many people want to see the Pope. They go to Rome as pilgrims and so forth. And it's also a way of teaching. The popes in history have tended to teach through writing documents or long letters. But then this custom developed, and St. John Paul II really took it to another level, you might say. And so this is its body of teachings on Wednesdays, a lot of Wednesdays, between September of 1979 till November 1984. And he just covers a whole lot of series of reflections on the book of Genesis, which is the first section, not the whole book of Genesis, just the first 3 chapters, in fact, of Genesis. So how can you write so much out of just 3 chapters? But it's actually very, very dense, and we will see that as he unpacks word by word, and he makes references to the Hebrew as well, and I'll explain a bit of that. But you just see that his own wealth as a philosopher and as a theologian that come into play in his own reflection. So he develops this whole thing called the theology of the body, whereby he's really saying that the human body, as created by God in his own image and likeness, and as made as male and female, has something inherently theological about it. In other words, it's a God word, because theology is God, comes from 2 Greek words, God, logos, God word. So anything that's theological is always a God word. There's a word about God that's spoken precisely through the body. And John Paul II is at pains then to bring this out. The overall work, so you can see it here, is 400 and something pages. And I was hoping to actually break it down and just do it in the 7 neat sections that it's actually published together. These were originally published as 3 individual books over the years, and then in more recent times, the last 20 years or so, they were published together in 1 volume, and it's come to be known as the Theology of the Body. George Weigel, a well-known Catholic theologian and commentator, has spoken. He's written the definitive biography about St. John Paul II. And part 1 is called Witness to Hope. If you have never read it, I encourage you. It's a tremendous biography. It's a long read, but well worth reading. He writes in a very good style, and you'll even learn something good about the use of the English language as well. So and then there's part 2, because it finished in the year 2000, and obviously John Paul II died in 2005. So he then wrote basically the sequel, or the part 2, and which was called The End of the Beginning. In other words, he's trying to put the focus on the legacy left behind by St. John Paul II. Well, during that first biography, The Witness to Hope, George Weigel refers to this teaching that of John Paul II over these 5 years, so September to 1979 to November 1984, as the Theology of the Body, as some kind of a theological time bomb. Because he was, in the backdrop of our oversexed world, our very vain world, a world that uses exploitation of men, of women, in a particular way of women, through advertising, pornography, a whole lot of other ways. In all of this, he's saying John Paul II has come up with a beautiful anthropology, a study of the human being, a study of the body that actually brings forth the beautiful wisdom that is contained therein in God's plan for the creation of the human race. So he calls it some kind of a ticking time bomb, a theological time bomb, because it is so rich, but also when people kind of have a discovery about it, they actually think, wow, I want more of this. And now there's a whole generation, you might call them the John Paul II generation or whatever you call them, but who've come into contact with this teaching, and particularly young married couples, and it's activated their life and their knowledge and understanding of the sacramentality of marriage, but also the profound meaning of human sexuality in their very bodily structure in a way that really hasn't been taught and appreciated by however many generations of Christians that have gone before. So, and I think George Weigel's actually right. Wherever I've seen couples who've been touched by this profound teaching, there has been just a great enrichment of their married life and their sacramentality, and they're able to live it with joy. Unfortunately, one of the things about the Church's teaching on sexuality, and I say unfortunately because it's put the accent on the wrong direction. So much of the way in which a lot of church teaching about sexuality was put forth was often in terms of do not, what not to do, what would be sinful, what would be negative, what I cannot do. But in fact, in terms of if the message of the Christian life is in fact supposed to be good news, well, we ought to be saying things in terms of this is what you should be doing, this is what is good for you, this is what will set you free, this is what will give you joy, this is what will make you happy. And so a lot of the teaching really about sexuality in up to really probably Vatican II, with the teaching on the family in 1965, Gaudium et Spes, the church in the modern world, included a lot there, and St. John Paul II as was he Archbishop then? I think he was already Archbishop of Krakow, or maybe he became Archbishop in about 69, Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow. But he was, I think, already Archbishop of Krakow. He was one of the guys instrumental. I think he was the secretary of that commission, and then developed a lot of that teaching. And then, of course, Humanae Vitae, which was very much inspired by love and responsibility. And then we have this beautiful body of teaching known as the Theology of the Body that has really put the accent where it ought to be, that married life, that sexuality is a beautiful thing. It's a gift from God, and it needs to be embraced and loved and cherished as an expression and a vehicle of our love for God and our love for one another. Yes, always requiring sacrifice, always requiring prudence, discretion, all those things. But the accent shouldn't be put on the discretion, it should be put on the revelation, the freedom, the energy that flows from it. So, today what I plan on doing, and again we'll see how far we can go. I mean, we'll go as far as we can get. I'm planning to cover the first 10 audiences, so which leaves us only a few minutes each. And then if we don't cover them, don't worry, we'll continue next week, and it'll hopefully take us up to the point of the proper title, we'll reach up to the point and including in the first chapters of Genesis, marriage is one and indissoluble. And then we'll continue next week. But if not, doesn't matter. I think it's better, rather than trying to rush it and just tiptoe, so to speak, through the tulips. It's much more important that we delve into it and allow, again, time for questions and answers, because it's something that if you let it, it is very formative and not just informative about our Catholic faith. So he goes on and he begins the catechesis by the first one, the title, The Unity and Indissolubility of Marriage, which he gave in September 5th, 1979. And he picks up the thread, you might recall from the Gospel, where the Pharisees come up to Jesus and say, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife on any pretext whatsoever? You remember that passage?
Yeah.
Great. And then Jesus says, no, it's not. He says Moses allowed us to divorce. A man could divorce his wife by giving her a writ of dismissal. He says, I know Moses did that from the beginning, but it was because of your hardness of heart, your inability to accept what God had in fact laid down from the very beginning, that Moses had done that. But it was never originally the intention. In fact, God made them male and female, and then the man leaves his father and mother and he cleaves to his wife, and the two become one flesh. Therefore, what God has united, man must not put asunder, man must not divide. So Jesus corrects things from the very beginning. You might recall there are other passages in the Gospel where Jesus reinforces what the Pharisees or the scribes are saying, because they're actually saying the truth. But whenever the old law needs to be modified or corrected, he does so. You have heard it said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I say this to you, if a man is angry with his brother, blah, 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 and so forth. Well, the teaching on marriage is one such teaching. But when we go back to, so what was actually Jesus quoting in the book of Genesis? Jesus was actually quoting chapter 1 in the book of Genesis. But in the book of Genesis, there are actually two versions of the creation of man. There's chapter 1, in the beginning God said, let there be light, and and that's the section that we read, the first reading of the Easter Vigil every single year. And that reading is essential, and from what I can recall, it cannot be left out. That's the chapter, the creation of the world, that we find in chapter 1. But then in the creation of mankind in chapter 2 is a bit different. The man is not male and female already. We see God constructing the man from the soil of the earth, called Admah, Adam, which means in Hebrew, land or earth. And then God eventually breathes into his nostrils, and so the man becomes a living being. And then God eventually realizes that the man is alone, and he then goes on, puts him into a deep sleep, and so forth. So Jesus starts off by quoting chapter 1 of the book of Genesis, but then he also delves into chapter 2, that the man and the woman are made for each other. And John Paul starts from this and then proceeds to tease out each of the different sections or the chapters in great detail, and word by word virtually, so that he can bring out the meaning, the original meaning. Because John Paul knows that these chapters, chapter 1 to 11 of the book of Genesis, are often referred to by scholars as being prehistory or prehistoric. And some scholars mistakenly, Catholic scholars even, mistakenly look at this and think therefore it's just mostly mythical. And by mythical meaning, it contains some truths in it, but there's no real foundation there in history. But this is actually inconsistent, and it's not consistent with the Church's teachings. The Church teaches that, in fact, these first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis are, in a sense, prehistory, because they're referring to the most ancient times, at the beginning, at the dawn of creation, at the dawn of the world, but they contain many important truths within them. And these truths are theological truths. And what St. John Paul II is doing in these catechesis on the theology of the body, he is actually bringing out the theological truth that is contained in these first three chapters that go to identify us as human beings, what makes us in God's image and likeness, what makes us man and woman, why our bodies are in fact theological and therefore set us apart from every other creature upon this earth. So he couches it in the discussion on marriage, and then he goes on from there. Let me just have a look, make sure I've covered all that in that first catechesis. So he keeps going on from the beginning. And what John Paul II is saying, that even though the beginning, we are no longer at the beginning now, there is something within us, insofar as we are human beings, that part of the beginning is carried within every human being. Insofar as we are humans, all those truths that are written down in very brief form in the first few chapters of the book of Genesis are in fact carried within us, you might say in our contemporary language, as part of our DNA, without meaning to reflect in the biological sense. So let's then go on and to analyze further the actual accounts of creation. In fact, let me just make sure, because I've started to delve into this already, and in the book of Genesis, so there's the first chapter, it comes from a tradition known as the Elohist tradition. And then there is the other chapter 2, which is known as the Yahwist tradition. So I said I wasn't going to write anything, but I am going to write something, just so that Elohist. Chapter 1. So Yahwist and Elohist comes from the Hebrew word Elohim, which is one of the names of God. And Yahwist is also a Hebrew word called Yahweh, which is a name for God. In fact, it's so sacred as a name for God that the Hebrews, or the Jews, modern day, would not mention that word. In fact, when, out of courtesy, when you're a student of Hebrew, when you're reading that sacred name, which in Hebrew is basically abbreviated, because in Hebrew there are no vowels, it's just words, consonants, and you read from this way, right, and go that way. You don't actually read Yahweh, you read Adonai. You insert a completely different word, and that's just out of the sheer sacredness for the name. Now, the Yahwist tradition, the sacred writer from the Yahwist tradition, is writing, this is what St. John Paul II is doing in chapter 2 of Genesis, and he's saying that's the older version of revelation that we have. Whereas chapter 1, from Elohim, referring to God, using that word Elohim, which we're able to do, the Jews would not take offense at that, then that is actually a newer thing. So primordially, the first understanding and examination of the human being is as an individual, as man and woman united already in one man. There's no male and female in that stage. And this is what's really presented for us in that first, that chapter 2 of the book of Genesis. And it's only later then, when God creates, that he makes them male and female and everything that flows on from there. So God makes the man, and he creates him from the dust of the earth. And the Hebrew word for dust or land or earth is Adma, Adam. So the name for man is Adam, and the name for land or earth. So he's taken him from the earth. And you might recall that in chapter 3, and I'll draw this connection for you now, just in case I forget to do it when we come to it, that God says, they commit the original sin, and he says to him, remember man, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And these words are so important that the church every Ash Wednesday puts it on her own lips. And so the minister, as he puts on, or she puts on the ashes on our head or on our foreheads, says, remember man, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Or the other version, listen to the gospel, turn away and listen to the gospel, and turn away from sin and listen to the gospel. But the idea is that there's a pun going on, remember man, remember Adam, that you are Adma, and to Adma you shall return. So that there's a play on words basically going on in the Hebrew there. So John Paul then goes on to say, well, what is this? Okay, so God makes this man, and he's living, and he's alive. He breathes into him, and what does this man realize? And we're told that in this chapter 2, God brought the animals to the man to see what he would name them. But there was no helpmate suitable for the man. And John Paul's saying that in this, what we see is that the man recognizes that he is a self-conscious being. He's alert. He's able to think about things. And he's able to think about these animals, and he's able to name them. So he has a certain knowledge. But also, the man recognizes that he is also a subject, that he is somebody who is able to make this decision, who is able to give names to all these other beings, all these other creatures. And then he goes on further and says, but more than this man also recognizes that he is unique in the whole kingdom here. That this man he's not like these animals. These animals have not received the instruction, till the soil and subdue it. So the feeding in from the wisdom that is also found in chapter 1, the Elohist tradition, the younger tradition, is already beginning to feed into it. But God doesn't give the command to any of the animals, you are to be the masters of the earth, to till it and take care of it, to subdue it. Have any of you come across the word, it's not commonly used, but kabash, kabash, to put the kibosh on something? Okay, the Americans used to use it when I was there quite a few years ago now, but I realized, what's the kibosh? It's basically to put the lid on something. But it comes from the Hebrew word, kavash, which means to subdue, to dominate. And that's the command given by God to the man. But the man also sees himself at this moment, at the dawn of creation, as being involved in a covenantal relationship with the Creator. He is set apart from everything else on this earth, all other living beings, because only he is given the task of naming these other animals. So God is expecting something from this man that he's not expecting of the others. He's also expecting this man to be able to till the earth, to subdue it, to carry on something that the others cannot. This whole experience is teaching the man that, hang on, I'm a subject, I am aware of this, so there's an intelligence, there's an alertness that's going on there, and that also I can have a say. I actually can decide. I choose what name I will call them. But also in so doing, he comes to the realization that there is no suitable helpmate for him found, which is preparing the way for obviously the eventual creation of woman. But then what are we told? We're told that it's not good that the man should be alone. And before I do that, I talk about alone and what that means. Just notice who actually notices that the man is alone. Is it the man feeling lonely, or is it the Lord? Well, it's the Lord who recognizes it. And while the experience of Adam was one of aloneness, what was also being involved in this is that aloneness is different from loneliness. Sometimes we need to be alone. And sometimes the aloneness, though, can actually be a feeling of isolation, which we tend to describe by loneliness. In this moment in the history of the world, God is recognizing that in being alone, the man is actually lonely, and it's not a good thing. In other words, there's something in there, in the man, that he's living and he is perfectly at peace with God. There's no original sin, and yet he is still alone, and it's not a good thing. God sees this and now wants to create the helpmate for the man. He then goes on. So he then makes the man into a deep sleep, and John Paul actually goes into what sleep means for various people, and he's saying the subconscious or the unconscious, and then just the conscious. He said that's not what the idea is supposed to be, but it's meant to be that a sleep that is induced by God, that this sleep is going to be a transformative one. That the man, as he was before, at peace with God, able to name those around him, he's constituted from the soil. So the body that he has received is breathed life into it by God, is constituted from the soil, but he is still alone, and he's not complete. And then he goes on to say that, so he puts him into the deep sleep. He takes the rib from his side, and in fact the Hebrew word, you can either read it as a rib or as from his side. St. John Paul doesn't go into why does God take from his side? Why not from his shoulder or from his foot? And some biblical scholars have said he's done this he's taken from his side so that woman is not considered greater than man or beneath man if he took it from his feet, but from his side so that she could be equal to man and be his helpmate and his true partner in life. Anyway, that's a nice explanation, and certainly is true. But the idea of closing it in the flesh is that now the man wakes up, the woman's brought to the man, and he realizes at last, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And the man realizes that his yearning that he had before is at last now able to be lived and to be expressed. Up to this point, John Paul II says that the image of God, man, we talk about man being made in the image and likeness of God, the image of God wasn't complete in the man. That the image of God is only complete when we are able to reach out in communion with another. It's a very interesting point. So in other words, the image of God is not just being in isolation, rather, as it was before, rather it's precisely in that ability to enter into a communion with another. Now, so what have we got established so far? That the man, the body, is created from the land, from the earth. That in his body, the man realizes that he is a subject. and that he is a self-conscious subject. He's able to see himself in this whole world, in this whole garden, where he is the kingpin. He is the one being given the command, subdue this earth. No other animal. He has knowledge. He's able to name them. He also has choice. And he's able to name what this choice, exercise this choice by the different names that he gives them. But he is now able to overcome this isolation because he has found somebody who is truly a companion of his. Bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. So notice it's all about the bodiliness. What the sacred writers, in their own imagery and mythical style, they're actually developing these deep anthropological insights into what it means to be a human being. Yes, we are animals. We are rational animals, though. And because we're rational animals, there's a part of us that goes beyond what can be seen. But the way in which we know each other is precisely through the body. And hence, the body becomes a vehicle for the theological, which is why then John Paul's the whole corpus here comes to be known as the theology of the body. He goes on, good, they're going well. John Paul then tears out and he says, before the woman is created, the man is just called Adma or Adam, the Adam. After the woman is created, he is no longer called the Adam, land or earth, but he's called Ish, which is the Hebrew word for man, and then the Hebrew word for woman is Isha. Ish and Isha. This only comes into being after the creation of woman. Before the creation of woman, the two were there, still the man, still the creation, but now the image of God within him is not yet complete. And so I hope you realize that's a tremendous little bombshell that John Paul, in fact, drops, that there's something about being able to reach out to another and to enter into that communion with another that actually completes the image of God within us. He also talks about then the boundary between original innocence and redemption. So on the one hand, the man is placed in the middle of the garden, and the woman is placed in the middle of the garden. And what does God say? Well, look, you can eat from all the trees that you like, including the tree of life. So your life will be sustained through this. But you cannot eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For the moment you do this, you shall die. Now, pause. Here's this man has been created. He knows that he has existence. He is in charge of this world. He has knowledge. He is a subject. He can choose. He has a companion now who's a helpmate. And, this is actually the first time also John Paul II notes that the man expresses joy and even exaltation. Before his helpmate was created, well, he was alone. He was isolated. He was incomplete. Now, him and his wife, as equals, as complements, are confronted by a whole question. Death. What does death mean? I mean, we think we understand what death is, and we do to a particular point. Why? Because we've seen its effects on others. We've seen other human beings die. But can you imagine if you're the first man or woman, and we can't imagine, right? But anyway, we can try. If you're the first man and woman, you've never seen death. You don't know what death is. All you know is what you are aware of at that time. You are aware of a communion that you have with this Creator, who has actually entered in some kind of a covenant with you. He has given you a task. You're to work, you're to do this, subdue the earth, and you have this complement. But now, if you touch this, you will die. And this is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So the bridge, you might say, between the original innocence and redemption, which is on the other side, is in fact knowledge. It's through knowledge that sin entered the world, the original sin. And we don't know what that is, and Scripture is silent about it. But so knowledge, there's something about that knowledge that is in fact profound. And it touches the human being. Animals don't have knowledge. Yeah, they learn, there's an experience, sense, but it's human beings who truly know and are able to understand themselves, because they're able to examine themselves as the object of their own study, or have themselves as the object of their own study. But then precisely through this, through the knowledge, we're also able to look forward to a redemption. While Jesus is answering the Pharisees about this question, he is really looking backwards, and he's saying, the original innocence that was lost and so forth. But Jesus is also speaking in terms of the future redemption that he was going to bring about. And then John Paul II also talks about he quotes from St. Paul in his letter to the Romans, where he talks about we are waiting for our bodies to be set free. Our bodies to be set free? Again, the body that has now lost its original innocence, and that doorway has now been closed, but precisely through the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So there was a certain curiosity, but the man and the woman are able to explore that. And why did they find that as a temptation? Well, we know, enter the serpent in chapter 3, and he goes to deceive. Adam and Eve, our first parents, sin because they are ultimately deceived. They're deceived through pride, that desire of wanting, that's what our tradition tells us, wanting to be bigger and better than what we really are. But they are deceived. And so deception is always about knowledge. Indeed, a false knowledge, but it's knowledge. And then through that, so this is what he says is the boundary between original sin and redemption. And it's interesting that he goes through such pain to do this. The meaning of man's original solitude, I believe I've already covered. The subjectivity, male and female. Man's awareness of being a person, I've really covered that as well, because he's a subject, he has intelligence, he has free will, he's able to choose, but he's also able to go beyond himself. Another important point, and I've touched this, but I just flesh it out a little bit more, is that John Paul says that the alternative between death and immortality enters the definition of man. So remember that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, yes, the moment the man and the woman eat of this, they will die. If they eat of it. If they don't have to eat of it. And what this in fact brings out is that man has a choice. Man, and I use the word generically here as man and woman, but man has a choice. Man does not have to do certain things. Man does not have to be lured by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Yes, he can go there, and then he will experience death. At the point of creation here, they still don't know what this death will be. They know themselves as existent, but they could only imagine, and for us it's actually much easier to imagine what death would be because we've seen it before. They had not, remember, their union with God had not yet been ruptured. And so it's, they've been provided or presented through choice, so the key is in their hands, but what lies beyond what they open is something they have no idea of understanding. And that had to, he says, would have left them with a great mystery. But at the same time, also, that would have led them with a sense of their identity as human beings, that they have a very important role to fulfill, and something that they cannot actually downplay, and shows their uniqueness in the rest of the creation of the world. And then we come to the original unity of man and woman. So, as we've said already, that the woman is meant to be the helpmate for the man. She is meant to be his equal, he is meant to be her equal, and they're supposed to help each other. In fact, the word sex comes from the Latin word sexus, which means divided. So it's just very interesting to see that our sexuality is really talking about our dividedness. And yet, through being united with the other person, then that division is mysteriously overcome. He talks about also how ultimately the original unity between man and woman is ultimately a reference to marriage and to the conjugal act, when the man and woman in fact do become one in one flesh. But he's saying that, and this involves a decision that is in fact you might say an application of a previous covenant that the man and woman have expressed to one another, as you are the one in whom I will find my completion, my fulfillment, that connection that I feel is missing from me. But he also, so he wants to see very clearly from the idea that our sexuality, although it is an integral part of our bodiliness, is in fact not just something that's physiological, but rather something that's profoundly theological, profoundly at the identity of who we are. And he says that when a person engages in the conjugal act, he or she is recognizing that there is in fact, they are a subject, but in giving themselves to another, they're also recognizing that me as a subject, in my own aloneness, is reaching out to another subject, another body, in their own aloneness, and I am making that aloneness my own. And in so doing, I overcome the aloneness and experience the union that is actually at the deepest longing of my heart. I've already mentioned that by the communion of persons, man becomes the image of God. I think we're going well here. This is great. I didn't think we'd cover all this. And any questions so far? Yeah.
You said that God recognizes that it's not good for man to be alone.
Yeah.
It might not be directly related to Theology of the Body, but I was kind of wondering why, like...
It's Catholic teaching. This is our springboard. Yeah. Go ahead.
Why, like, there's God who is sort of above man, and there's creation that's sort of below man in that sense of hierarchy, that there's a need that man has to have another on the same sort of level as him. It can't be content with just God or in his aloneness.
Well, it goes back to before, like in chapter 2, which is the Yahwist tradition, which is older as a source of divine revelation, that the man is he's complete in himself in the sense that he is at peace with God, but he is has no one to reach out to. And what the sacred writer is saying is that the very creature, in order to be in the image and likeness of God, has to be able to enter into a communion of persons, which is what God is, as we will find out much later in divine revelation. So what makes God God? That there's in fact three persons who are each this one God, and they relate to each other as a community of persons. And he's saying that, what John Paul's saying, that it's only in being, in the creation of woman, that the image of God is actually brought to its completion. So it's a necessary and constitutive element of personhood and of being in the image of God, that you have to be able to reach out to another. And if there is no other, then that God is designing you would be to frustration. And that would be a crazy God to do that. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's, it's, in other words, a complete one, although it's complete in the sense that, as a body and so forth, he's actually not complete. And that's what John Paul is saying in chapter 2, the sacred writer is trying to grapple with, that although he was breathed life of God, he designed the names, he was in the covenant with God, he actually wasn't complete.
It seems almost a bit like an apologetic for someone that would say, like, I only need a relationship with God, there's nothing else, I don't need other people in that sense. Like, as Catholics we talk about the communion of saints and things like that.
I think it's actually an argument against that person.
Yeah.
The person, not a did you say an
Apologetic
apologetic?
against that idea.
Yeah. Correct, an apologetic against that. Yeah. In other words, we can't just be complete as just relating to God alone. No, we need also in others. And he goes on and just step by step, he'll flesh it out. Talks about how woman receives her own fullness and through childbearing and being a mother, and why that's so profoundly important for her. But I just think it's a very insightful point that the image of God is not brought to completion until the creation of the relationality, the creation of woman. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
How does that relate then, going on to what Lachlan said, how does that relate to those who are hermits or live a reclusive life?
Oh, sure. I mean, how does that relate to those who are hermits? Hermits were not always hermits. Hermits are called to live, and it's a very peculiar vocation and a relatively rare vocation, to live one's life on their own. But so they're connected in the communion of saints on a spiritual level, but a hermit has been raised in a family, and a hermit will receive supplies, from different people or whatever. They may not be involved in deep ongoing relationships, maybe in their time of living as a hermit, but nevertheless they have had plenty of relationships in their lives, and they always had experience at least of one relationship. It's not so it's like the idea of Robinson Crusoe and meeting Man Friday. This man had never met another human being before. That's like the original Adam before the creation of Eve. And you'd be looking at you and think, wow, you look a heck of a lot like me. I've never seen one of your kind before, and there's something in that just must come alive. Can you imagine if everything you've seen around you reflects nothing of you? And this is also one of the points John Paul is getting at, that when a man and woman give themselves to each other in the conjugal act, they're actually looking for something of themselves in the other, but they're also looking for a completion of themselves in the other. And it's this law of the gift. And we'll see this repeatedly being brought about. So, speak up in a loud voice, please, so the camera will pick you up. Yeah.
So, when a man and woman they marry, so it's the woman that the man is going to marry is actually made from that person's rib.
Oh no! Is that the woman that the man is going to marry? Is she made from his actual side or rib? No, the answer is no. The scripture talks about it that way to teach us that God has made woman from the same substance as man. So the original Adam, the original man, was complete as a bodily creature, but personally, you might say, he wasn't yet complete. And it was only in the creation of woman that now he is able to relate to somebody who is like himself, in whom he could see something of himself and she could see something of herself in him. So the idea of taking from his rib or side is just simply acknowledging that what God has created to be a true helpmate to him was in fact from human flesh. It was a human body. He didn't take a good-looking cow or an elephant or something like that and turned them into something. No, it was a human being. Yeah. Last question, because we're pretty much on time. Yep.
Is the rib coming from Adam's side a prefigurement for Christ? The wound on Christ's side?
Look, I don't think you could say that in terms of exegesis, but in figurative terminology, you might say those sorts of things. I mean, the church fathers would draw those sorts of connections, but because they draw so much parallel between the new Adam and the new Eve, and the first Adam and the first Eve. So, you know, I could see them doing that sort of thing, but exegetically, I don't think you could. So, we're going to have to end there because we're out of time. So, thanks for coming, and we'll see you next week for continuation. Thank you.